Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for coming to celebrate with us this historic 25th year anniversary of our Asian American Studies program. My name is Kingsley Song, and I'm a current senior and member of the Asian American Studies Undergraduate Advisory Board. Today, we have been able to bring in Cathy Park Hong as our annual Yoonmee Chang Memorial Lecture, which brings a distinguished speaker annually in honor of Yoonmee's memory and her work. Yoonmee Chang was born in Seoul, South Korea, and grew up in New York. She received her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania in 2003 with a specialization in Asian American diasporic literature and culture, and was an instrumental leader in the founding of the Asian American Studies program at Penn. Yoonmee, author of a critically acclaimed book, Writing the Ghetto, Class, Authorship, and the Asian American Ethnic Enclave, taught at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, before becoming an associate professor at George Mason University until her death in 2018. This conversation and Asian American Studies program at Penn would not be possible without her work, and we're so grateful to her family to be able to honor her memory with such an incredible speaker and lovely moderators. And for our conversation today, I have the honor of introducing our lovely moderators, Dr. Jo Park and Dr. Ang. Dr. Jo Park is an associate professor of English, as well as a member of the Faculty Steering Committee and former director of the Asian American Studies program. Dr. Park's interdisciplinary and wide-spanning work has led to her affiliation with the Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, Korean Studies, and Cinema and Media Studies department. Dr. Jo Park specializes in modern and contemporary American literature and culture, with an emphasis on American poetry and Asian American literature. Her most recent book, Cold War Friendships, Korea, Vietnam, and Asian American Literature, examines Asian American subjectivities shaped by wartime alliances in Korea and Vietnam. The co-editor of the Asian American Literature in Transition, 1930-1965, she has also served on the editorial boards of American Literature, the Journal of Asian American Studies, PMLA, and Verge Studies in Global Asias. And then our other moderator is Dr. David L. Ang, who is a Richard L. Fisher Professor of English. He's also a professor in the program in Asian American Studies, Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. As a recipient of numerous research fellowships and the Kessler Prize from the Center for LGBTQ Studies, Dr. Ng's work has had a significant influence on the field of LGBTQ studies and Asian American studies. Dr. Ng specializes in American Studies, Asian diaspora, critical race theory, psychoanalysis, queer studies, gender studies, and visual culture. Dr. Ng is the author of The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America, and is also the co-author of Racial Melancholia, Racial Disassociation on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans with Shinee Han. His current book project, Reparations and the Human, investigates the relationship between political and psychic genealogies of reparation in Cold War Asia. And yeah, I would like to invite them to the stand. Thank you so much, everyone.
So it's wonderful to see all of you. And in order to kick off this keynote panel, I can't express how excited I am. I'd like to invite Dean Paul Snigalski to give a few remarks to us.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to keep this really short because this is not about listening to deans. So I want to make some remarks as the institutional representative of the university and some very brief personal remarks. I have things written out, but I'm going to keep it even shorter than that. As the institutional representative of the university, I want to say the same things that my boss, Steve Fluharty, said. We are delighted to have the cluster search going on and to have one hire in sociology and more coming. We look forward to supporting ASAM going to the future for the next 25 years and beyond. We understand as a college, as a school, as a university, the central importance of the program. to the study of America, broadly speaking. I want to make a few personal remarks because life is personal, after all. I went to the ASAM 20th anniversary at Joe and Ichiro's invitation a little under 5 years ago. I still have the coffee mug from that, and it reminds me of the program every time I drink from it. I learned a lot then. I was just new as college dean. I learned about the history of the program. I learned about the hopes and ambitions of the people involved in the program. And over the succeeding months and now years, I learned from the UAB members, who I like, and from the faculty in the program and Faria. I learned about the program and about the importance of it. All of that is institutional, but it's also personal. It's also personal. And I look forward to those relationships deepening personally as we go forward with the program. I want to, if you'll forgive me, just add another personal note to this. And this is very personal, and I hope you'll understand the way in which I express it. My daughter moved to New York City 3 years ago to make her way. And when she moved to New York City, a friend from college in Ohio got in touch with her, and they fell in love, and they're a happy and loving couple. Austin is a Chinese-American man from Queens, the son of Chinese immigrants. Austin is a part of our family. Emma is a part of his family. So there's a broadening and an affinity there that's happened for me personally in the last 3 years. It's very personal. And one of the things that I have now heard from the people I love is the way in which America's racial climate and the threat of violence against Asians affects their lives when they walk out on the street to go shopping or to go anywhere. I have heard this directly and personally. So I share that not to say in any way that I have a full understanding, of course not, but to say that there's an affinity, that there are people I love now in my life who have talked to me about these things. That certainly matters deeply to me. ASAM matters deeply to the college, to the school, to the university. I look forward to all the progress we're going to make in finalizing hires this semester and seeing the effects that these new faculty will have on our program and on our students in the college, the new teaching they'll bring, and so forth. It's a program that celebrates and studies the Asian American experience in all its dimensions. And I know in the panel we were already hearing about those dimensions. It's not unidimensional at all. There are many, many dimensions. So that's it from this dean. Happy 25th anniversary, ASAM, and many happy returns.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I appreciate so much how you added the personal, especially because our headliner here knows how to sharpen the personal. So I am honored to introduce Cathy Park Hong, a poet and author of the best-selling Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, published in 2020. Minor Feelings was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It was awarded the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography, and its influence extends from these heights of the literary world all the way to my cousin, who has been texting me about it from the minute she opened the book. So Cathy Park Hong is the recipient of the Windham-Campbell Literature Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship, and her poetry has received many, many more awards and accolades. She is the poetry editor of the New Republic and a full professor at the Rutgers Newark MFA program in poetry. So I am a devoted reader of Cathy Park Hong's poetry, and so I want to underscore her 3 collections: Translating Mom, 2002, Dance Dance Revolution, 2007, and Engine Empire, 2012. Each of these truly inventive books feels like a high-wire act, and what they are balancing is language laden with personal, national, and imperial pasts, and remarkably futures. Rereading them, I follow a thread from the secret language of home, that's her phrase, an intimate and shattering Korean in the first book, to the extraordinary Creole she fashions in the second book, constructed around the 1980 Gwangju uprising in South Korea, and then the frontier language of empire in her third book. So the wonder of this verse is its force and resonance, as in the ballads of Engine Empire. I mean, I can't express enough how important Engine Empire is, which traces the career of an American foundling into a terrifying outlaw who rides off into denuded earth. Cathy Park Hong has crafted rhythms for relating the bloodshed of revolution and empire, and her poetry forms a major body of avant-garde verse that presents the troubled voices of pioneers bound up with histories and inherited speech. But to her bestseller. So Ali Wong's appreciation for minor feelings, and when Cathy Park Hong was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people of 2021, expresses what I think we all felt, and this is what Ali Wong wrote. Reading it is such a crazy feeling. I felt so seen that I couldn't believe that this book existed. The crazy feeling of reading my minor feelings, I felt Ali Wong's incredulity as I read, because this voice was saying everything. Everything I teach in class, everything I think, everything I'm afraid of. There has never been a book like this for Asian Americans, and Minor Feelings is a reckoning for America and really everywhere in the 21st century. We are so lucky to have Cathy Park Hong here today to mark the 25th anniversary of the Asian American Studies program here at Penn. Please join me in welcoming her.
We're going to play a clip from Time magazine. It's the most amazing clothing you've ever seen. I was like, Cathy, do you own all of
None of it's mine.
But we barely exist anywhere in the public eye. But when we complain, Americans suddenly know everything about us. Why are you pissed? You're next in line to be white, as if we're iPads queued up in an assembly line. Minor Feelings is my own personal reckoning on the Asian American condition and what it means to live in this country as an Asian American. The recent urgency that I felt was to write from a personal perspective. When I became pregnant, I found out I was going to have a girl. I wanted her to be comfortable in her skin in the way that I wasn't. So it was important for me to write a book where I could sort of try to change this country's consciousness. This year is just one instance in a long history of anti-Asian racism. This is the pattern of American history where there's racial conflict and we pay attention to it and then we move on. But we don't actually deal with it. We don't actually confront it and we don't actually engage with it for a sustained period of time. I didn't intend the book to be like an anti-racist manual. In one sense, I'm so happy that for Asian Americans and other people of color who have been having a really hard time this year, if they find solace or discovery in my book, then I've done my job, you know. But I also hope that for other readers who are just newly discovering Asian American stories, that they don't stop with my book, you know. I hope that they go much deeper, and I hope that people will read and understand the stories of Americans who have been invisible for so many years.
Cathy, thank you so much for joining us today. And I wanted to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us today in person, on Zoom. Thank you to all of our students, alumni, allies who have been fighting tirelessly to sustain and to grow our program in Asian American Studies over these decades. We are 25 years old today. Yay! That means that the program is officially a Pisces. And Pisces are very creative, as is Cathy. God, I wish I were 25 again. Anyway, a lot of you are 25. So, Cathy, I taught your book this week to my students in my Introduction to Asian American Literature and Culture class. It left them speechless. And I've been teaching in the field for 25 years. I found myself underlining almost every passage in the book. It's like you've taken so much of the historical and personal issues around Asian American and Korean American identity, more specifically, and you've distilled them into a prose poem. So I just wanted to read 2 sentences from the book to give you a sense. I imagine all of you have read this, but I will just underscore them again. 1 sentence from your chapter, The End of White Innocence. One characteristic of racism is that children are treated like adults and adults are treated like children. Or again, when you write in a later chapter in Education, you're talking about your 3 friends from Oberlin. We had the confidence of white men, which was swiftly cut down after graduation upon our separation, when each of us had to prove ourselves again and again because we were, at every stage of our careers, underestimated. So you don't begin Minor Feelings with friendship and coalition, but you actually begin it with depression and a scene of what I would describe as an analytic failure. So Cathy goes and seeks a Korean American therapist, and after the first session, she fires you. She ghosts you. She refuses to work with you. This is an intense moment to start the book. What I would call, Korean on Korean violence. So what made you decide to start the memoir this way?
Before I answer that question, I just want to thank everyone here. Thank the Asian American Studies Department. Thank you, Joe, for that beautiful speech. And I have to say, this was actually the first time that I saw that clip in full because I refused to see myself. Maybe this is another racial dissociation that you talk about, but I was like, I cannot look at myself, and this is the first time. I'm like, it's not actually so bad.
You look fabulous.
Oh, yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, I know.
Time magazine has really nice clothes.
They really do. They had a whole rack of couture. Got to play a celebrity. It felt like Charlize Theron or something. And thank you, David Ang. You are also a hero of mine. I met David when I was 22 years old, and I was an emotional mess. And I think you were talking about racial melancholia when we met. And that really, I believe that also kind of sparked an idea in me when I was writing my first book of poems, which I think is Minor Feelings kind of boomerangs back to, because that was the first time I wrote a book of poems was personal in the way Minor Feelings is personal. To answer your question, when I was writing Minor Feelings, the therapist section was not supposed to be the first. I didn't imagine beginning Minor Feelings with the therapist section. Actually, my original idea of the order was that it was going to begin with stand-up. And then as I thought about it, I thought, no, it had to begin with my really fucked up, dysfunctional relationship interaction with this therapist, because it was, the book I don't believe writing is a form of catharsis, but I thought this book was a kind of form of therapy for me. And in a way, it's like it was my own sort of chronicling my own sort of journey of decolonizing my own mind, you know. And I wanted to start from a place of extreme estrangement, extreme isolation, where I couldn't even go to a therapist, and I couldn't even get the therapist to relate to me. And there was a lot of projecting happening and so forth. And then from that moment of extreme isolation is a kind of journey that takes place throughout the book, where I find where I'm able to, like, you know, to kind of quote Sarah Ahmed, or to paraphrase her, is to kind of take a step back and not only see my alienation, but understand the apparatus in which that has made me feel alienated, you know, and then to find a community through friends, writers, mentors, you know, as a way to kind of struggle against that apparatus that makes us feel alienated, you know, so.
Okay, now my turn. So, I mean, this is building off of what you were saying, David, and also what you're saying, Cathy, about connecting minor feelings to translating Rome. Like, that's kind of my question, you know.
Well,
so,
yeah.
like, so you say you began Minor Feelings as a dare, and I just wondered about the relation of this book to your poetry. And you know, like, sometimes poets write memoirs that have like lineation. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and like they take different forms. How did you decide on the form of this? Because it also feels like it just like came out this way too. So how did you decide on the form of this?
It was a painful and painstaking endeavor. I mean, the book was, I write about my process actually in Minor Feelings, that originally was, it started as poems. And I realized, and I wanted the poems to be satirical, but I couldn't figure out how to be funny through writing poems, and then there was like an ill-fated summer in which I tried to write a novel, and that was, of course, a failure. And then it essentially turned into this book of essays that's kind of like a palimpsest of my past failures, and you know. But it's like, you know, I wrote the essay like a poet would write the essay, where the paragraph was like a prose poem. You know, David was commenting on that before, where each paragraph was a prose poem, and instead of and when you think, if you're a poet, you think about the way a poem progresses. It's kind of a journey of one's inner thought. It has like, it's probably more closely attached to the rovings of the internal mind than, say, a short story. And in that way, it's also very similar to the essay. So that's how I treated it. And it was more, and the way, it was very intuitive, where, you know, the way I kind of connected different scenes and ideas together. You know, analysis together was more by patterns of images, recurring images, sound, and so forth, rather than any kind of linear argument I was making. But it was the same impulse as translating Mom. I think I like to make my job really difficult for myself, where, like, before I write a book, I think, okay, what is a subject matter that I'm really scared to write about? Or what is a way of writing that I haven't written before? I've always stayed away from. And then I masochistically dive in. And so that was, with translating Mom, it was about the body, right? And that is a really, really common subject for feminist writers. But for me, it just seemed like an absolute conundrum, because if I were to, you know, to write about or write around the Asian American female body seemed almost an impossibility because of our historical erasure and fetishization and so forth. And it was the same thing with Minor Feelings, where it was like, even though I have always written about race and thought about race, I haven't really personally really dealt with Asian American identity in a way that I thought was honest to my experiences. And so I decided to dive in there, you know. And I was always curious because, you know, I have a lot of, I don't think it's this way anymore, but when I was younger, you know, especially during sort of the post-racial period, during Obama and before, you know, whatever that means, yeah, there were a lot of Asian American writers who kind of disowned that moniker, you know, who would always say again and again that they feel pigeonholed by that term, Asian American, and really stayed away from it as if it was like a really uncool sweater or something, you know. And so that was also a challenge. And I was like, or, you know, or they say it was overwritten, you know, that, you know, writing about Asian American family or Asian American politics was overwritten. And I'm like, how the hell is that Asian American identity, anything related to Asian American identity, overwritten when people talk about, like, write about being a 20-something-year-old white guy in New York, you know? Like, how many books are there, like divorce in the suburbs of Connecticut? We've seen that story so many times.
Hey, I love the ice storm.
Yeah, and so I was like, how many times have we read that story? But then you see two stories about the Vietnam War or two stories about, you know, an immigrant family, and they're like, okay, we've reached our quota, that's enough, you know.
You know, we live in, quote unquote, an officially colorblind world. So we actually have a paucity of language to talk about race at the same time that all we see around us is racial violence. And this is something that Shinyi and I write about in our book, which is that the social contract of model minority citizenship is to be colorblind and to render yourself colorblind. And
Yeah.
I think that that's why, you know, your book was so resonant, because it's so honest and raw and real about that self-erasure. But, you know, now that we're on the topic of masochism, you have another incredible line about your experiences in the book. And this is at the beginning. You say, I can tell you I have attracted all kinds of wild, vituperative behavior from white people because I never play the role of a compliant Asian woman. And that social contract of colorblindness is also a social contract to be compliant, agreeable, never to rock the boat. And, you know, what I admire about you as a person, but also in your work, is that you're not compliant. But I also say this to my students, and I say it to my friends, and sometimes I say it to myself, that some of the most smart and outspoken Asian American women I know, women students I know, they feel exactly that way, and they've suffered for it. So I actually, can you give us an example of this wild vituperative behavior that you've elicited and how you've handled it?
I mean, there's been so many. Every job I had, you know, the schools I went to, I'm trying to think of an example. You know, even in a very progressive newspaper, like when I was actually right around the time that I met you, I was 22. I was 23 years old, and I got a job as a fact checker at the Village Voice. And for those of you who don't know the Village Voice, it used to be it's a legendary alternative weekly that has since closed down, but it was like, you know, founded by Norman Mailer, and it was reporting on police brutality at the time, and I really valued my experiences there, but you know, it was a diverse workplace, but it was still the head editors, publisher were all white men. And, you know, while working there, I was always treated like a servant. You know, as a fact checker, you have to go to the writer and say, you know what, this is not correct. You know, this needs to be capitalized, or any little kind of error. And it's a combination of me being a young woman and me being an Asian, but also an Asian woman, which I think is like it's doubly impacted. And if I stood firm on my ground, it was just always incredible to see these middle-aged white men just lashing out at me and like saying that they were going to fire me and that I had no right to say this or that. I mean, they didn't go so far as like calling me racial epithets or anything, but this is just, it was typical whenever I stood firm. And it's like, there's studies like for Asian American women that they are the least likely, people are, from managers or whoever, when they email people, they're the group that's least likely to have a response back, and that sort of was very typical of me when I was in any kind of institutional, when I was teaching, when I was a young adjunct, where I was mistaken for a student at the time, where I was disrespected by my students, disrespected by my chair, and I just took it. A lot of times I did actually take the bullshit until I stopped, and then that was when the vituperative reactions would happen.
What's really interesting is that so much of the debate around affirmative action today is all about college admissions, and it's obviously about college admissions at 8 Ivy League schools, and we're not talking about university education in general. In that discourse, everything is focused on college admissions. But in fact, what we know from sociology is that Asian Americans suffer not in terms of getting into college and getting educated. They suffer after they graduate. And they suffer in the workplace because they're the people who are the least likely to get promoted into management of all racial groups.
Yeah.
And when I think about what you're saying, Cathy, I mean, that actually is, the university is our workplace.
Yeah.
Right? So the experiences that you're relating are about what happens after you graduate.
Yeah.
Whether you go to the corporate world or the tech world or the world of education. And
Yeah.
it's that insight that has made me think about why it's been so hard to also establish Asian American studies.
Yeah. You're treated basically like an invisible servant. And of course, I already enumerated the examples when I was in grad school in Iowa, where the racism was much more explicit, where, my poem would be workshopped and the teacher would say, make some joke about eating dog, Asians eating dog. I mean, just really egregious racism that, it becomes normalized and you kind of accept it. But then I was also, at the same time, outspoken for someone. I didn't always take it. And when I didn't, people thought I was a troublemaker, so.
Can you read to us from the book? So there's a passage which I was like, oh my God, this passage is killing me. So why don't we read it, and then Joe and I are going to talk to you about it. This is from Bad English, right?
Okay.
The chapter on bad English.
It was once a source of shame, but now I say proudly, bad English is my heritage. I share a literary lineage with writers who make the unmastering of English their rallying cry, who queer it, twerk it, hack it, Calibanize it, other it, by hijacking English and warping it to a fugitive tongue. To other English is to make audible the imperial power sewn into the language, to slit English open so its dark histories slide out. In the essay Other, From Noun to Verb, the poet Nathaniel Mackey draws a distinction between the noun other, which is social, and the verb other, which is artistic. Artistic othering has to do with innovation, invention, and change, upon which cultural health and diversity depend and thrive. Social othering has to do with power, exclusion, and privilege, the centralizing of a noun against which otherness is measured, meted out, marginalized. My focus is the practice of the former by people subjected to the latter. Mackey borrows his title from Amiri Baraka, who aptly defines the history of white musicians profiting off of black music as turning, quote unquote, a verb into a noun. For instance, swing, the verb, meaning reacting to music, was a black innovation before white musicians stole and encased it into the commercial brand swing. Mackey demands we wrest back the white man's noun and return it to a verb by quote unquote breaking into the colonizer's English and alchemizing new words out of local vernacular. My own method of othering English is to eat English before it eats me. In that process, we might eat each other like a scene out of Park Chan-wook's film Old Boy, where a man marches into a sushi restaurant and orders a live octopus, which comes whole and slithering on a plate. He tries to stuff the entire octopus into his mouth, but it's too big. The cephalopod covers his whole face while cinching its tentacles around his head so that he can't breathe. Eventually, he passes out. On good writing days, I am the octopus.
I just love that idea of the octopus. But this idea that nouns arrest, I keep on thinking about racial stereotypes and how they are an arresting, and how verbs, they keep things moving. And I think also about how the racial conflicts and tensions that we face today are the result of really long histories of race and empire that trace themselves back to the beginning of modernity, and the ways in which in that period, even something like color, black, it moves from being an adjective to a noun. But what I wanted to ask you about this passage is not just that, but the fact that you bring Nate Mackey and Amiri Baraka and Park Chan-wook and yourself into a kind of racial coalition. And I wanted you just to talk more about your views of the possibilities of Asian-Black coalition versus inter-Asian coalition. Korean, you have a Filipino friend who said, oh, Cathy, Koreans are really self-hating, but Filipinos are not so much. So I'm just interested in all these different kinds of coalitions.
My Filipino friend did not like the fact that he was quoted in that book. I don't know. I've said this multiple times in interviews, I see Asian American identity as more of a coalition or an alliance more than anything else. It's like a series of overlapping circles where we have these nodes of connections, And I think that is actually a really kind of kind of like a holistic and invaluable model for the way we think of race, rather than seeing us as these sort of, silo-sized, groups or these kind of isolated color blocks. That in fact we are, we have these overlapping similarities. And I'm thinking I'm actually sort of ambidextrous. I was originally lefty, and then I swear this is relevant. I was originally lefty, and then I was forced to be a right-handed person, and now I'm kind of use both hands. So now I made lemons out of lemonade or whatever. But I think it's if there's a way to think about race in this more ambidextrous way, where we not only think about our differences, but we think about our kinships, our similarities, our nodes of our connective nodes as well, then I think there's a much richer way where we could find solidarity and coalition building, which has been a real passion project of mine. It's really, really, really important now in the kind of bifurcated politics that we're living in. So I don't know, when I'm bringing up Amiri Baraka, Nathaniel Mackey, I'm thinking why don't we think about race not just in terms of what our skin color is, and what we look like, our physiological appearances, appearances of difference, but also what our oppositional, what our goals are, and what are, in our histories, and what our histories of persecution and oppression are. Obviously, my history is nothing like Nathaniel Mackey's history of enslavement and dispossession and segregation and policing and all of that. But still, I think we could find nodes of connections there. And as artists, we can find a language, or an approach to language that could bring solidarity. And for that, that's where I was talking about bad English. When I talk about bad English, I'm talking about, like, I grew up outside the institutional standard English and feeling very alienated by that, in the way that many immigrants from all different racial backgrounds, also Black Americans, have lived outside that. And all of us, in one way or another, are always code switching, right? And Rodrigo Toscano said that code switching is a matter of survival. It's a way of assimilating. It's a way of, like, inflating or deflating your racial identity, which also kind of really shows how much race is a performance, right? So it's like going back to your question about, like, how do you react against this sort of model minority, like when we choose to be complacent or choose to assimilate to our model minority personality, that's a performance. But even when I'm reacting against that, that's also a performance. That performance is always your appearance or your affect that is always at odds on how you feel inside. That is also, that kind of conflict of outside and inside is also something that is shared by many marginalized groups. So we have to look at it from many different facets. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the whole book, but this chapter of bad English was just especially important. And I think of your poetry, like the Desert Creole. It's an extraordinary English that you're creating there, and how I think your poetry is doing that. You say the risk that culture will die if we don't innovate our language through cross-cultural contact. And you're showing that innovate. It's like so fast, like every second. The language is changing all the time, and that difficulty of keeping up. But also what you're describing, the mismatch between, like, what you're saying and what you're feeling. And you've said this already, but how do we deal with that? And I love the example in the book of your father's use of "I love you." To me, it's incredibly poignant. Maybe from my own experience too, but that kind of the problem of that intelligibility. In some ways, I think a lot of avant-garde poets like yourself are, like, tracing that, the gap, the distance between what you're saying and what you mean. But there's so much pain in that. So I just want to hear more about that break.
Between the inside and outside, and in terms of my poetry, or just like
all of it. Yeah, your poetry, like. But I think your poetry captured, because your poetry is moving so fast. Like I think your poetry is extraordinarily, like, showing the inside and outside. Like, you actually, in my reading, like, I feel like I understand you. In your poetry, because it's like. You're capturing the changes. It's so rapid. It's so innovative. But when we're walking and going to Target or whatever, it's not. We don't innovate that way.
No, it's how I wish we would innovate. I don't know. Definitely not. But I do. And I write about it in bad English. I think it's more just sort of like a fun house distortion of how I grew up speaking English, right, or learning English, which was from a pastiche of sources in bad English. I actually have a friend who's grew up in Korea, and he's practically, he's extraordinarily smart, but he's practically fluent. He was practically fluent before he moved here, and he said he learned his English all from The Simpsons. Like, really, that's it. He learned. He spent 1 year, but it was all from The Simpsons. But I think, that's just how we learn. That's like, it's from Simpsons, or it's from listening to hip hop. It's like from or it's from the Bible, or it's just this sort of this mishmash of different. And it's also like, I don't know, like a lot of Koreans I knew also didn't grow up in the white suburbs. They grew up in Koreatown, or just these areas where it was like, where there where there was a huge Latino community, or it was different Asian groups who spoke different languages, a different way, people who or Filipino, Cambodian, and they all had the different accented English. And I think it was what I was trying to kind of convey was that kind of different mishmash of English that we learn, and it was my way of weaponizing it, from the way inherited culture, Western inherited culture, and the English language forms you and is spoken through you. I think that a lot of times when we think of the English language, we think of it as just a neutral mode of expression. But as I've tried to emphasize again and again in Minor Feelings, learning how to speak a certain language also shapes who you are, your subject position, and it's a way for me to kind of mangle it,
Yeah. So I'm switching gears slightly, just to talk about Teresa Hakkyung-cha a little bit. And I think so many of us have been obsessed with, and haunted by your obsession is like you trace it in really magnificent ways in Minor Feelings. And you detail your kind of obsession with her death. And I'm just so fascinated by your reanimation of biography. And, for me, some of the most powerful things in Minor English are like the questions you're asking while you're doing it. What am I getting from doing this? That runs all the way through the book. So, and the old critical tendency to say, oh no, we can know from the work and not the life. And you're kind of cutting against that. So, I think I understand your kind of longing for knowledge, but I also can't fathom a more intimate text than dictate. She's telling us like how her vocal cords feel, And so, I mean, this is a question you ask of yourself too. What do we get from that biography? But also for readers of your poetry, what do we think Minor Feelings helps us to read, say, Engine Empire? Or, what do you think knowing who you are kind of helps us to read your poetry?
That's a good question. Can I ask you that question first and see how Minor Feelings is like? I have to take a beat and think about that. I mean, I think that I think, it's also that kind of question of the inside and the outside, right? Where so much of Dance Dance Revolution and Engine Empire are performative. It's like just sort of taking the Asian American body and saying, okay, you see me as invisible or you see me as hyper invisible. Well, let me turn that into this kind of caricature. And okay, you think I speak bad English. Well, let me take this bad English and really just turn it into this sort of fantastical, this kind of fantastical cartoonish language, using artifice to point out at artifice, using it's a kind of pageantry that I'm trying to do. I'm not saying it's similar. I mean, the way, it's almost like I'm writing in drag or something, whereas by using persona and using speaking in a bad accent, to show how ill-fitting and wrong a lot of these sort of gender and racial prescriptions are. Whereas Minor Feelings is me taking the mask off, really, is taking sort of the costume off and trying to kind of understand, the infernal circle, where that's a quote from Frantz Fanon, that is going on, that is propelling me to kind of perform or act out or react in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a beautiful response. Thank you. I mean, I have to say, I read Dance Dance Revolution, and then I read Minor Feeling, and then I reread Dance Dance Revolution. It was different, actually, after reading this book. In part, for me, your book is like minor feelings is like you somehow access my brain, you know, and you're going where I think I needed to go. And then in Dance Dance, it doesn't, I don't have that intuitive relation to Dance Dance Revolution, but the movements I think were, the resonance of those movements, I somehow, but I also kind of understood why we had to learn the historian's biography and stuff like that. You know, like, like the tendencies that you had and why the Gwangju material appeared when it did. I think reading Minor Feelings helped me with that.
I mean, it's almost like the historian was more an extension of who I am.
Yeah.
Rather than, whereas like the guide was like my alter ego. You know, it's just sort of, I mean, basically those are all the characters in my poetry books are alter egos, you know, the inflated self.
You know, Donald Winnicott, who is a child psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, has a concept of false self. And that concept of false self is that you always are overly compliant with the demands and the wishes of others. And when you do that, you have no relationship to your own feelings. And so I actually feel like the way in which you turn yourself inside out is to show us what's behind, you know, what it's like actually to be able to experience your feelings.
Yes.
So, I mean, that for me, that is so powerful in terms of turning the inside out. We're going to end on this last question and then turn it over to the audience, Cathy. But I was thinking about what you said earlier about racial coalition, and the line that just kept up coming up in my mind is a line from Angela Davis, where she says that we cannot let our identity drive our politics. We have to let our politics drive our identity. And I just think that's, again, a beautiful poetic nugget, right? Our racial politics should drive our identity. Our racial identities should not, drive our politics. So thinking about that and thinking about the fact that you said you were going to start the book with Richard Pryor, I was so moved by that chapter. I thought it was brilliant because you're literally educated out of your depression by watching Black comedy. And you say, quote, watching Pryor, I realized that I was still writing to that institution. I've been raised and educated to please white people, and this desire to please has become ingrained into my consciousness. So you publish Minor Feelings to enormous success and acclaim, rightfully so. And, I was saying to Cathy earlier, I was like, oh God, I hope they make a movie out of your book. And she's like, oh, actually it was optioned. So I want to know who's gonna play you. But does this mean then that you've received white recognition? How have different racial groups reacted to the book and why?
Well, no, I don't think it's actually white. Well, yes, the white audience came later. But it was actually from Asian American readers. It was like a lot of the readers came from word of mouth. And I was really lucky to have an Asian American editor. I was really lucky to have a Black publisher who advocated for me. I was really lucky to have a queer agent. But when the book was being shopped around, there were definitely publishing companies who said, and there was more than one, who said, there's going to be no audience for this, or this book is going to attract a really small audience. And I think about the number of books that have not been published because the same thing has been said over and over again, that there's not going to be an audience. And that is a fallacious comment to make, because if your book is urgent enough, beautifully written enough, powerful enough, it will find an audience, and it doesn't matter. And that, I was very blessed and honored for that to happen, where it was like, it came from Asian American women, Asian American men, and it just kind of orbited, it just kind of like sort of expanded from there to other, readers of color, immigrant readers, white readers, artists, writers, and so forth. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I struggle. I'm very blessed, and I feel very honored. The success came when, I mean, I'll just say this. I struggled for a long time as an obscure poet. So the success came a little bit later, so that I feel a little also sort of detached from it as well. I'm like, well, that's like happening, but this is, the time clip was like, that's happening to a different person. I'm still the kind of obscure poet in my mind. And going back to what you were saying about Angela Davis, that's a beautiful quote. And this is something that I say again and again about Asian American identity, is that, sometimes I think that when we write about Asian American identity in op-eds or in books or, talk about it, it's like this Ouroboros of qualifying statements where we're saying, oh, I'm talking about East Asian or cis East Asian or Southeast Asian, I don't mean this. And it's like we're always sort of also very apologetic about like how much we're including and how much we're excluding. And if we'd thought about it less as a demographic issue and more about an ideal, more about what are our, more as like an oppositional, if we think of the identity as more oppositionally, what do we want to achieve? What are our shared goals? What are our struggles? If Asian American identity, in the way that queerness and blackness actually are defined, if we see it more as a verb rather than as a noun, then I think we would be less uncomfortable about how, about the elasticity or the boundaries of what Asian American is. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we need to really think about. And you talking about the limitations of vocabulary and the limitations of language, it's like, that joke or what they say about Inuits having 50 words for snow or whatever, this, cliche or whatever it is. I mean, I think we have to constantly expand our vocabulary, find ways to name the internal conflicts that we're feeling. And also, I think what's also really important is that it's not, being Asian American is not just about naming our affliction, naming what hurts us, naming our woundedness, but also naming our joy, naming our what brings us joy, what brings us together, what kind of what kind of creations we can make. That's why art inspires me so much, especially during this time. What kind of creations we can make during this time of struggle.
I think we should turn it over to the audience, Joe. Is that
Yes.
cool? Okay.
Yes.
If you have a question, you can just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
You're like my class.
Oh, I see. They're now popping up.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for running over here. Hi, I'm Anne from Asian Arts Initiative. I'm so excited to see you here. But I'm just mostly asking this because what I thought was so remarkable about Minor Feelings was it was infinitely quotable. But is there something you can give us, just as like a layperson, maybe even? I'm not coming in the context of UPenn, but from outside of it. But are there words you can share that you feel like kind of encapsulate this moment, especially the joy aspect of it that you just said, when we can name joy in our community?
At this very moment right now?
Yeah, like if you're on Jesus Samara, what would be your bodega sign?
I'm sorry, if you were what?
Sorry. Just anything. What I found so beautiful about your book is that it is quotable, but do you have some words that you feel like resonate with you for this moment that you can share with people?
such an important question, and it's also putting me on the spot because the quotable passages in Minor Feelings were not off the cuff. It was painstakingly realized. I think right now, politically and just what's happening in the country, there's a lot of pain and confusion. And there's still this ongoing problem that we feel our voices are not being heard, despite the fact that there are now more media attention to the violence against people in our community. And there is that same, and what I'm sensing from everyone is that there's both a sense of affliction, that's a sense of fatigue, right? Because it's not unabated, no matter how much we talk about it. And I guess what I want, I don't have anything quotable, but I will say that within the last 2.5 years since the book came out, what has moved me to tears is how so many of you have come out. I'm not talking about even in terms of my book, but the activism, being there for our elders, protesting with Black Lives Matter, registering voters, all the many Asian American poets, artists, fiction writers I know. And I all I can say is that you're not alone. We're not alone. I think I've come a long way since that moment when I was with my therapist and lashing out against my therapist. I think we are, as a collective, are just growing. And we are really finding strength through the way we speak to each other. And we're kind of defining this moment and defining who we are. And we have to continue doing that. It's not going to come overnight. And I think this is why it's so frustrating. But I see it happening.
Hi, I'm Angela. I'm one of the members of the undergrad advisory board for ASAM, and I loved your work. And specifically, I really enjoyed your commentary about Richard Pryor's work doing stand-up. And for one thing, I would love to hear if you have any stand-up jokes or no pressure. But I love the fact that you did that at some point for your poetry readings. But I'm curious, especially because you mentioned that Minor Feelings started as a satirical poetry work, but then you figured out that it would work better in this prose form. So how do you see the role of humor and comedy and playfulness in your work?
That's a great question. Humor is just, is an integral part of my writing. Yeah, I like to kind of show the whole spectrum of human emotion, and I'm not a writer who can only write in the sincere, the mode of sincerity. I also need humor. I like to use humor. I write about this in the chapter on Richard Pryor, but I also love how you could weaponize humor, use humor to pull the rug under someone. In that way, it serves as a really cunning rhetorical tool where you tell a joke and then there's a punch. You don't know that's coming your way. So that was what I learned a lot from humor. But also going back to the question, what I was saying about joy. It's really important for me when I'm writing about racial injustice or the kind of racial melancholia or disassociation, that there is also laughter as well. And laughter can also be a form of strength, you know. And I talk about it in Richard Pryor as well, like how that's where Black humor comes from. You know, there's that joke that Richard Pryor says, talks about the slave ship, and there's two people sitting next to each other about to row, the oar or whatever, and one says to the other, he's like, you think your day was bad? Yesterday I was a king, you know. So, but it's like it's like, first of all, that joke there is first a way of it's also a way of dealing, right? It's enduring, or kind of finding some way to minimize the pain of whatever trauma that you're going through, shrinking it down so you could laugh at it, right? So that's one way of just sort of, tolerating it, you know? But then also humor can be used as a Trojan horse to kind of smuggle all the ugly truths that people would otherwise not want to hear, you know? And I think humor is really great for that.
The filmmaker Alice Gu was here yesterday screening The Donut King, and if you haven't seen it, you have to see this film. It's incredible. And in the Q&A, she was talking a little bit about humor and how when she was doing the documentary, she was talking to these kids, you know, who had been working in their parents' donut shop, and one said to the other was like, oh, you know, I had to work in that donut shop day and night, you know, since I was 10 years old. And then I said, you're so lazy. I had to work in my parents' donut shop when I was 6.
Well, I'll go around like this.
Apologies. I'll just stand up. Hello, hi. The part about, I want to talk about the bad English part. It moved me, sorry, I'm thinking of a moment. So just a couple days ago, I was helping my mom call Geico. And I just told her, my Korean mother who speaks quote unquote bad English, she has a tendency to not use verbs. She speaks in nouns. So I told her, just include the verb in the middle. And I think after reading the book, I found myself wanting to step back from correcting my mom constantly. But at the same time, I know that it's not getting delivered. Sometimes the English she uses doesn't deliver the right message. And sometimes I wonder, what is a medium language that's, you know, you've also mentioned you were an obscure poet, but it's Minor Feelings that really put you in this stardom, really. And it's because Minor Feelings is a very specific medium and language that's, you know, more accessible in a way that has made us be here. And so I think I'm constantly mediating what is monstrous, what is a language that completely distorts it, but at the same time, it delivers what we need it to do.
You know, it's funny because, like, when I was writing poetry, like Dance Dance Revolution, it was really influenced by the bad English that I grew up in, as I wrote in Minor Feelings. But you know, ironically, that was my parents and family friends and relatives couldn't understand they were just like, what the hell is this? But the same uncle who appears in the book, who there's a little dialogue about where he asks me about crabs. Well, basically he's like, he asked me what the word for crabs, like the STD, was, and I told him. And anyway, he was the same one who said, "I'm sorry, Uncle is too ESL for this." About my poetry book, and I was like, well, I don't think anyone understands, so don't worry, you're in the same, you know. I don't know if I'm answering your question correct right here, but I would say that I really understand. I have a lot of, I hear you, I mean, I think like it was the same experiences that I had with my mother and father. Unfortunately, I had more negative feelings associated with this. I felt burdened and resentful and embarrassed as when I was a kid. And this is something that all immigrants, like the children of immigrants, a lot of children of immigrants will identify with, where you have to be the public ambassador, a translator, intermediary of your parents, and that puts you, when I talk about your where there's this kind of authoritative role reversal, that puts you in a position of authority that's really uncomfortable, especially if you grew up in a kind of family like my family, which is very Confucian. And it's like in the house, it's like you were supposed to really respect your mom and your dad. And, it was the language of obedience, not free to be you and me. And then outside of that, you saw this complete role reversal where you had the authority and your parents were just condescended to because of the way they spoke English. And it's a constant negotiation, and I think that, like, I don't think you're, I think it's like, both allowing your understanding where your mother is coming from and really kind of maybe curbing that instinct to want to correct her all the time, or at least understanding what the intention behind that is. Is it because you genuinely want to teach her so it makes it easier for her to get around in this country? Or is it also this kind of, or does it also come from a place of shame, And so think about those, really think about the roots of those intentions. And maybe that would also, because I don't think, like, if I were living in a strange country and I was, my daughter spoke, say, Spanish, was fluent in Spanish, and I wasn't, and she was always correcting me and so forth, I think it's also about how she does it, if it's coming from a place of compassion, protection, or shame, embarrassment. Unfortunately, it's usually a combination of all four. How would you answer that question?
I don't know. I'm like about to cry because I think you're making me think about, the way I learned that my parents even had an accent. Because when you grow up as a kid, you naturalize everything. So everything around you is quote unquote normal. And then when you go out into the world, that's where you're taught that it's not normal. And I just remember kids saying, "Oh, your mom has such a weird accent," and I never thought of my mom as having a weird accent until then, right? So, it's intense. But I think that what you were saying about the drive to correct, whether it induces shame. I mean, when we talk about racial melancholy, we often talk about our generation, the Joe generation, you and me, like second generation, and the way that we've internalized all these losses. But obviously, that's the same about your parents. I mean, I think about so many of the students today who are coming to the States as parachute kids. They're coming when they're 12, when they're 14. I think about how hard it was for my parents to come in their 20s. And that's the phenomenon. When we were all in school, if we were Asian American, invariably we were second generation. But the fact is that the classes today are more and more first generation. And we have to respond to that shifting demographic.
I mean, that's something also, that's different. Like with globalization and with global capitalism, how there's much more kind of going back and forth. E.J. Koh, by the way, has written, wrote an excellent book about how her parents just left them to go back to Korea. And she was like in middle school or early high school and so forth, and they were just sort of on their own,
I mean, what does it mean to be physically independent at that age, but you're not psychically independent?
Yeah.
Cathy, can we do 2 more questions?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Stephanie. I recently read a piece of commercial fiction that the main characters are Taiwanese American. And in conversation with the author, I said how meaningful it was for me, having never really seen Taiwanese American characters. And I asked the author, what did you want to make sure you put in the book? And her response was, wow, I'm so surprised, because she said, when I wrote this book, I didn't really mean to write it like a Taiwanese American. She said, I just did it because I'm Taiwanese American. So I'm reflecting back to what you said earlier about publishing and your response, the response you received in Minor Feelings. What do you see in the future of publishing, and do you think, when will we get to the point where authors are writing their stories because they're authors telling their stories and not because they're Taiwanese American or Korean American, et cetera?
I see it happening now in fiction and in poetry, and I'm hoping it'll continue. As far as like the general American public picking up a book because they're just interested in the story or the style of writing or the author, rather than like, oh, this could be an interesting ethnographic experience, I think that's going to take probably a much longer. But Viet Thanh Nguyen was just here. He talks about this all the time, this idea of narrative plenitude, where if you want to kind of collapse the single story, where it's the same sort of, same kind of immigrant story that you hear again and again, is to have all different kinds of stories. I think they're coming out in poetry, definitely. I think poetry is actually 10 steps ahead of fiction and nonfiction, where Asian American poets are, I'm seeing like, just at the top of my head, Franny Choi, who's writing like science fictional cyborg Korean poetry, to like Divya Victor, who's writing about like the anti-Asian hate against South Asians after 9/11, to let's see, Rajiv Mohabir, who's writing about being queer and South Asian and writing it in all these different kinds of wild form and all these different forms of English. It's actually an incredible time to be an Asian American writer, because the gates are pushed open. And while it's partially open, we have to just break it down. So that it's just, there are no gates. I think there will always be a quota of some sort, or there'll always be trends of this kind of writing or that kind of writing. But for it to remain this way, writers of color, people of color, have to take control of the mode of production. So it's not just about like writing more books. It is like, having more authors, but we also need people of color who are publishers, who are agents, who are editors, who control the kinds of stories that are being told. And that's also happening, but at a much slower rate. And I think it will eventually go there. But in terms of like the output, I'm definitely seeing much more diversity now than I did definitely even when I was in my 20s or even my 30s. I mean, it's just actually I know legislation, in terms of this country's legislation, like it seems like nothing is happening. But culturally, I have to say, like as a teacher, when I was like teaching 10 years ago, like whenever I brought, this is not like a critical race theory class or an Asian American studies class, this is just a poetry workshop. Like whenever I brought up the word race or anything, everyone would just be silent. Or and there'd be one black student speaking up or one Asian American student speaking up. Now, when I bring it up, it's just a really fruitful dialogue where everyone is talking and everyone is respectful for each other. And it's an amazing thing to see.
Hi, Cathy. Thank
Hi.
you. My name's Diana, and I really appreciate you being here with us today. One of the reasons why your book, among many reasons, I think, oh shit, really close to the speaker. I'm gonna maybe sit next to you. One of the reasons why I really liked your book was that you carved out a space to really go deeper into Asian American female friendships. In fact, the copy I have was gifted to a friend of mine with whom I find, as I'm reflecting, we've been nurturing our female friendship with each other over years. We met at Penn here, but she's like self-described as an East Coast Asian versus I am a West Coast Asian, and I know, there's like all these different terms, and it's been a delight that it was her that would recommend the book to me, because I find myself saturated with a lot of Asian American culture, which I'm grateful for, but I have a blind spot as a result, and oftentimes she brings in a lot of her experiences as a Vietnamese American to me, and how she grew up as the only Asian in a white town and her struggles with that. And yet we weave together all these different wonderful parallels. So it was a delight that A, she recommended it to me and I enjoyed it very much. And then B, the section you had about Helen and Aaron and yourself. And I was wondering if you can go a bit more into your decisions to include that part of the story, or any challenges you had to incorporate some of those really raw details you included about your friends, because I think part of the honesty and rawness is what makes my connection with my friends so strong. That's unique as an Asian American female friendship, not exclusively to the racial aspect, but I really valued you creating a space to just show its authenticity.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That means a lot to me, what you just said. I mean, I will say that just for every chapter in Minor Feelings was like, it was just like a lattice work of inhibitions, like everything, like every chapter, Teresa Hakyung Cha chapter, the stand-up chapter, anything. I had to kind of untangle all the inhibitions I had. And it was a lot of emotional labor to first get there before I could get to sort of the vulnerable core of the subject that I was writing about. And even now I think, well, if I could go back, I could even dig deeper, because it's really hard to get to that point. And in relation to the chapter about friendship, that was actually the first story I wrote, the first essay I wrote for Minor Feelings. And it was really, really, really important. And it's interesting, actually, the people who have written reviews, like Goodreads or whatever, I'd say it's like their least favorite chapter, because they don't understand how it's related to Asian American identity or something, or they're like, it felt like it was out of place stylistically or what have you. But I thought it was absolutely crucial to my friendship during college, was so crucial to who I am now, and the kind of, and how I don't take bullshit, or how I'm able to write the way that I do, or kind of take the risks, the creative and emotional risks and intellectual risks, is because of my friendships from college. And it was really important for me to not just write about being the lone Asian, but that I had these like-minded friends, and we didn't just talk about family, and we didn't just talk about our boyfriends. That what really bonded us together was art making and books, and because we were there as a group. As I quote in my book, art making was a mission and not just a fantasy, and that we were entitled to it because we weren't alone. We were together doing it. So it was really important for my formation as the person I am today. But I think when I first started the essay, it was originally just about Aaron, because I wanted to write just like a really kind of uncomplicated essay about feminist solidarity. And Helen was in it, but in a really peripheral way. But the more I wrote it, it was through the revision process. K.S.A. Lehman talks about this. Honesty, a lot of the honesty comes through revision. And it was through revision that I was like, no, I need to have Helen in here because she's such an integral part of our friendship. But then it didn't become this neat, tidy story of feminist solidarity. Then I had to deal with her being a bad friend or me being a bad friend or writing about mental illness. And also, and this is what ties the Teresa Hakyung chapter with Hakyung Cha chapter with the education chapter, is this is a conundrum that a lot of memoirists go through. What does it mean to write about someone who you're close to? What is it? When is it like an invasion of, just in terms of life and art, and how much do you separate life and art? And do you need permission to write about this person if they're no longer in your life? And I wanted to, and the only way I resolved those questions was just making transparent those questions in the essay. But I also had to write about that. I had to write about the fact that, Helen was not a well person, and that, that our friendship was not just dysfunctional, but abusive. And, and also the subtext about a lot of the friendship is intergenerational trauma. And I wanted that to be a subtext. I wanted that to sort of inform, how we were able to, how that was all kind of in the soup of being in college and dating and making art and having fights and all of that. But the glue that also bonded us together was that kind of trauma that Erin originally gave me permission to write about. And then at the end, she said, no, you can't write about it. And I realized at first, I was like, this essay doesn't work without me writing about that. And she's like, no, our friendship is on the line if you put that in. But then I thought, actually, it was better that she didn't. And I just had that conversation in the chapter. Yeah.
Cathy, before we turn to the book signing, that's another favorite. Can you just read the next sentence? This is the end of that chapter. It's so, from here. Just read it, all again.
I'll read the
whole thing
Okay.
because I cut it off, but it's so appropriate to this last question.
Okay, so I'll read we had the con from there. We had the confidence of white men, which was swiftly cut down after graduation upon our separation, when each of us had to prove ourselves again and again, because we were at every stage of our careers underestimated. But I wouldn't have had it any other way. That struggle kept me faithful to the creative imagination cultivated by our friendship, which was an imagination chiseled by rigor and depth to reflect the integrity of our discontented consciousness. No one else cared. No one else took us seriously. We were the only ones who demanded we be artists first.
Please join me.